Much to see on the road from Amman to Baghdad. There was sun, of course, searing a mighty hole through acre after acre of blue. Camels and goats, foraging for unseen greenery. The odd bomb crater and chewed-up vehicle, including a bright red Ferrari, which would have made more sense on the moon. A mile after mile of highway, hugged by a watery haze and cutting a swathe through the flat and featureless desert landscape. We'd been on the road for what seemed like forever when it was my turn to take the wheel. I'd travelled 14 hours the day before and was driving on autopilot. My mind and body merged with the vehicle and tarmac beneath it. Before I'd set off that day, I'd been convinced, hopeful even, that something might break the monotony. But as the mileometer ticked over, all I could think about was getting home and collapsing in my pit. It was as I was telling my colleague Dave of my evening's plans that something caught my eye in the wing mirror. I looked over my shoulder to see headlights flashing behind us. It was about 5:45 and there were no other vehicles on the road. My immediate thought was that it was the American military, no problem. But as the vehicle gathered speed and drew closer, I realised that it couldn't be the Americans because the vehicle, a black Mercedes, had blacked out windows. I then thought it might be a security company. But if it was, what did they want me to do? Pull over? There was no way I was taking that risk. I informed Dave that we had a possible target to the rear. Dave informed me that there were in fact 2 pursuing vehicles. As I was considering the possibilities, the windows came down on the front vehicle and 4 AK-47s emerged. Oh, fuck. I glanced to my left and saw a sign that said Fallujah, and it dawned on me that something big that I thought might happen, that I desperately wanted to happen, was happening. In the very place I'd imagined. Talk about tempting fate. I thought to myself, you fucking idiot. My body began to roast from the toes upwards, my senses heightened, which happens when you're suddenly pitched into blackness. My mind contracted into a tangled ball of confusion so that I couldn't think. I'd gone into shock. It was as if I'd died for a second and was looking down on myself. I had no idea what I was going to do. I felt very alone, vulnerable and pathetic. An image flashed through my mind, me on the side of the road, minus my head. But it wasn't just me who was in danger of being killed. I was responsible for Dave behind me and 12 civilians piled into vans in front, employees of ABC News. The pressure and anxiety were about to spill over when gunfire rang out. AK-47 fire is very distinct and very intimidating. When there are 4 going off at the same time, it's like some hellish orchestra. Extremely noisy and extremely nasty. In fact, and rather appropriately, it sounds like the cracking that signals the start of an avalanche. But when a couple of rounds came over the top of our vehicle, which might have buried some people, it was as if a hypnotist had clicked his fingers, bringing me out of my trance. In the military, as soon as it gets noisy, it gets real. It was at that moment that my training kicked in. I knew that unless I tamed the stress, we were all going to die. So I gained control of my breathing, stripped away all of the shit that didn't matter and began to think rationally. The people in the front vehicles didn't matter. It was my actions that mattered, because it was my actions that would affect them. I had to put aside all the different pressures and anxieties and deal with the threat. That was the only way to resolve the issue at hand. It had all happened so fast, but once I had my breathing under control, everything slowed down. In effect, I was able to control the speed of events. Some might think a second is simply a second, end of story. But a second is only as short or long as the person who experiences it. You can decide how long a second is, but only if you're at ease with the situation you're in. If you're stressed and panicking, a second will feel like no time at all. If you're not, it can feel 2 or 3 times as long. You only have to watch sport to realise this. Most people facing a punch thrown by a professional boxer would wear it and hit the deck. But another professional boxer might see that punch coming, slip it, and come back with one of his own. That's what I had to do. I gave Dave the order to stand by and flung our vehicle towards the middle lane to our right. It wasn't a move I thought about. It was just instinct. The enemy pulled up beside us on our left, which was quite foolish of them. They were now boxed in by the central reservation and had no idea who we were or whether we had weapons. As it happened, I had my left hand on the steering wheel. and my right hand on my MP5 Kurtz, which was on my lap. Meanwhile, Dave was sitting behind me with an AK-47 of his own. I checked the safety catch on my weapon was off. I looked to my left through the closed window. I've been in gunfights before, but this was the first time I'd see the whites of the enemy's eyes. I was no more than 2 feet away from the guy in the passenger seat. I could have reached out and touched him. He was just a boy, wearing an Arab headdress and white robes. This kid is the same as me, I thought, just working for someone else. His expression wasn't aggressive or menacing. He looked like he didn't want to be there. As uncomfortable as the boy looked, he still did what he thought he had to do. His AK-47 fell in line with my head, as did the AK-47 behind him. I stared even more intently into the boy's piercing blue eyes, as if trying to make a telepathic connection. I desperately wanted to hear him say, "Don't worry, I'm not going to shoot you." Instead, silence. I really didn't want to do what I needed to do. But all he had to do was feather the trigger, and that would have been it. I had to take action. I was at breakpoint. If I took the situation to the next level, poked the hornet's nest, it might make things worse. But it was my only hope to make things better. If I did nothing, we were going to get shot and people might die, including me. Stacked up against the door, balaclavas on, weapons at the ready. Who exactly is behind that door is anyone's guess. There is nothing but silence. But when we go in, it might get very noisy very quickly. People might get shot. People might go down. People might end up dead. Contrary to what people believe, Special Forces soldiers aren't supermen. We're just ordinary people. We can't see through walls or around corners. Bullets don't bounce off us, and we don't hit the target with every shot. But because no plan survives first contact, what we do is train and plan meticulously so that we're battle ready. If the shit hits the fan, we're ready to rock. Or at least we should be. In computing, a breakpoint is defined as an intentional stopping or pausing place in a program, put in for debugging purposes. In the Special Forces, we're so highly trained that we know when a breakpoint is approaching and that we need to pause and debug. That's when we take a couple of deep breaths to lower cortisol levels, which in turn gives us greater focus. We call that recalibration. Then we do our thing. In fact, that's the Special Forces mantra: breathe, recalibrate, deliver. It's our way of regaining control of a situation that might be spiraling off in a dangerous direction. But breakpoints aren't exclusive to soldiers in the Special Forces. They're in all of us. Our lives are dictated by breakpoints. Every day is full of them. They don't have to happen in dramatic circumstances, while you're dressed head to toe in black, wielding a laser-sighted machine gun and climbing up the side of a ship. A breakpoint might be a crisis that needs solving in the office, an unexpected bill that needs paying, or a relationship that's taken a turn for the worse. It can be even more mundane than that. A breakpoint might be a sink full of dishes and having to decide whether to wash them before you go to bed, so that you're not faced with a kitchen full of clutter in the morning and they're ready to go again. A breakpoint might be spending the evening working on your business plan instead of getting shit-faced down the pub. Breakpoints are about going the extra mile, clambering over obstacles, even while travelling in what seems like the wrong direction, and facing down negatives to achieve your ambitions. A breakpoint is a moment you decide nothing will stand between you and your goal. A moment you decide to step out of your comfort zone in order to move forward and grow as a person. A moment you refuse to accept your self-imposed limits and go beyond what you thought you were capable of. As such, breakpoints are more mental than physical. It might seem strange to describe coming under attack in Fallujah as being in one's comfort zone. But more comfortable than trying to fight our attackers off would have been accepting my fate and waiting to die. I knew I had to make a decision that might make our attackers even more dangerous than they already were. But it was the only way I was going to escape the situation. Some people think that being comfortable is a good thing, but that isn't necessarily the case. Someone might feel comfortable working in an office Monday to Friday, taking home a comfortable wage, living in a comfortable house, driving a comfortable car, going on comfortable holidays twice a year. But comfort isn't normally conducive to growth and contentment, Despite your comfortable existence, you might be dying inside. The problem is that the alternative can seem terrifying, like making the decision to hit your attackers before they hit you. It usually means rejecting your comfortable existence and voluntarily entering a scary world of uncertainty. A world that is, on the face of it, worse than the one you're already in. But by daring to step out of your comfort zone, you might be creating opportunities to make life better. Chapter 1. Maverick Marine. Being told you can't do something can be incredibly empowering, often even more so than having everything laid out for you on a plate. So I should probably thank my old maths teacher for being so negative. I was 14 at the time, chatting away in class as usual, and the teacher, not for the first time, let me have it. "Ollerton, pay attention." I sprang to my feet like a jack released from a box. "I don't give a fuck about this, I'm joining the Marines." The teacher sneered at me from behind his desk. "Ollerton, you'll never be in the Marines. You've got no discipline." That was a turning point. Almost an epiphany. It was the moment I realised that school and academia wasn't for me. And never would be. The teachers all said that I was intelligent, but I had no interest in studying. I had no interest in being part of an out-of-date system that was all about churning out little glove puppets for society. People who worked behind desks in offices, people who had expensive weddings, big mortgages, and lots of debt. The education system didn't suit me, like it doesn't suit a lot of people. I didn't want to be programmed like the other kids, have all the creativity and dreams drummed out of me. That was something I wasn't willing to accept. I was a rebel. I couldn't be doing with people telling me to do things I didn't want to do. People who don't conform are treated with suspicion. If you're not interested in what they put in front of you at school, you're written off as a nuisance, and you end up ignored and ostracised. Society isn't concerned with how well you perform as an individual. It's concerned with how well you fit into the system. But I've always believed that if you want to fulfill your potential, don't conform. My maths teacher thought that because I refused to conform at school, it would be impossible for me to conform in the military. He thought that because I didn't have the discipline for schoolwork, I didn't have the discipline for soldiering. What he failed to see was that I simply wasn't interested or stimulated by what he was trying to teach me. While teachers and schoolmates thought I was losing it, in fact, it was around that time I started to find my way. True, I was flunking exams and bunking off school, phoning up and pretending to be my mum in a ridiculous high-pitched voice. "Matthew is ill today and won't be coming in." It never occurred to me to try and impersonate my dad instead, although my voice was probably closer to my mum's anyway. But I had woken up. I wasn't a lost cause at all. For all my troubles, I was in a privileged position. I was that rare kid who knew exactly what he wanted to do with his life. There was no point flogging a dead horse because I could already visualise where I wanted to be in a few years' time. All I cared about was becoming a soldier. I was there in spirit. I could always see myself dressed in green with a gun over my shoulder. That wasn't the only time that someone in authority wrote me off as a kid. I can vividly remember going to the Royal Navy Marines careers office with my mum and saying I wanted to join. The woman behind the desk replied, "If you get into the Royal Marines, what do you want to do?" I'd studied the brochure in detail. I knew every word and every picture. So immediately after she said that, I flipped to the middle pages, where there was a photo of a combat swimmer inside a submersible insertion craft. I pointed to it and said, "That's what I want to do." The careers officer looked at me and laughed. "Everyone wants to do that. What do you really want to do?" "That's what I really want to do." "Fine. Well, good luck with that." She could have said, "Wow, what a great ambition. If you work hard, you'll do it." Instead, she laughed in my face. That's the military for you. Every bit as suspicious of nonconformists as the education system. But it's probably the best thing she could have done. It's not as if I walked out of that meeting thinking, "I'll fucking show you." But a seed had been sown in my subconscious. That photo of the combat swimmer in his submersible insertion craft was a symbol of what I might be able to achieve if I refused to accept the limits imposed on me by others. I love my country and the idea of being part of a tight-knit family, a brotherhood. Since the age of 14, I'd been living it every day. Everything I watched and everything I read was to do with the military. I'd flick through Combat Survival magazine and daydream about being in a battle and fighting an enemy. Getting in seemed inevitable. Had I not, it would have killed me. My grandfather had been a captain in the Royal Engineers, and I'd been captivated by the Falklands War as a kid. Especially the TV images of soldiers returning as conquering heroes, to the sound of cheers and the sight of 1,000 Union Jacks being waved. That was the last of the proper land wars, and the last Britain fought alone. When you're a boy, you only see the glamour and manliness of war, which is what gives you the passion to want to join up. You're not privy to the bits in between, the horrific realities that lead to broken minds and bodies, and hundreds of shattered lives all over the country. Someone else who unwittingly motivated me to join the military was a guy called John. He was from my hometown, and there was a lot of friction between us, in part because I got off with his girlfriend. It was him who made me investigate joining the Royal Marines, because he'd become this bigwig around town since joining up himself. Whenever he came home from training, he and his mates would turn up at the appropriately named Clown's nightclub, and there would be a big shout out from the DJ. "Welcome home, John, our resident Royal Marine." I'd be leaning against the bar thinking, what a cock. But I was more jealous than anything. John found out that I was talking about joining the Marines and started telling everyone in Burton that he'd be on the training team and he'd never let me pass. Once again, it was someone telling me that I was going to fail. I was 18 when I went on the Potential Royal Marines course, PRMC. That was 2 years after I wanted to join up, for reasons I'll explain later. I was fit as a flea, smashed the 3-day course out of the water, and was accepted on the 29th of May 1989. A date that is etched on my mind. I was still suspicious of authority, which some people will find strange. You can't question authority at all in the military, and we're led to believe that soldiers don't last if they don't conform. But failing to conform would be a recurring feature of my military career. Even before I joined up, I was taking little jabs at the bosses. Before leaving for the 32 weeks of basic training, I went and got my head shaved. It had to be done, but I was going to do it in my own time rather than have it done for me. Far less cool was what happened the night before I left when I dived off the Trent Bridge and hit the bottom of the river, bashing up my face. On the train down to the Commando Training Centre at Lympstone, I bumped into Troy Robson, a black guy with an afro and a big silver chain with his name on it. We ended up in 576 Troop together and formed a close bond. I loved him to bits, as did everyone else, but being the only black guy meant he was always going to get a fair bit of ribbing. One of the first things we did on arrival was pick up our gun. I couldn't wait. When I walked out of that room with my SA-80 assault rifle, I was proud as anything. Standing in line, I felt like a real soldier already. Then I heard uproarious laughter, followed by the sight of Troy walking out of the room with a spear. Troy found it funny as well, but if that happened today, there would be an inquiry and sackings. Training was brutal from the outset, as it had to be. Some recruits didn't even make it through the first night. The discomfort of being away from home and the intimidation of the training team was too much to bear. The people constantly barking at us were fully fledged Royal Marine commandos. Gods in most of the recruits' eyes, and they scared us shitless. Not that they threw us straight into the rough stuff. The first lessons we learned were basic administration and personal hygiene, including shaving, showering, and ironing. I regretted not offering to help my mum press those piles of shirts on a Sunday afternoon. I would have picked up some valuable lessons. I was taken aback by the meticulous attention to detail that was demanded of us. At times it seemed pointless. I hadn't joined the Marines to iron shirts. But eventually I understood that all that shaving, ironing and polishing was essentially a metaphor for operating in a war zone. Sloppiness becomes habitual, and your life and your mates' lives are dependent on the minutest of details, be it the cleaning of a weapon or checking behind a door during an assault on a building. The learning curve was steep, with each new skill taught against a backdrop of beasting so savage that no Royal Marine ever forgets them. I certainly didn't find it easy. No one does. But my passion and drive were just so strong that I knew I'd still be staying after 32 weeks. Proud as punch in my green beret. My progress was made that bit smoother by my new buddies. Every Marine thinks that their training troop is special, but 576 troop contains some particularly fine people, none of whom I'll ever forget, and many of whom I'm still in contact with. In order to become a Marine, you have to pass the commando tests. One of the tests is tackling an assault course while carrying full kit and a weapon. And the last part of the assault course is a 6-foot wall. For most recruits, that's not an issue. But for the smaller guys, it can be. We had a guy we called Yoda because he was short and stout and he failed to get over the wall twice, which meant he had one final attempt. And we couldn't have Yoda not passing out of training with us. He was such a great bloke and a fine soldier who just happened to be a bit shorter than the rest of us. So Troy and I came up with a plan to get Yoda over the wall by banging a nail into the bottom of it so that Yoda could push off with his foot. We managed to find a nail, but not a hammer to bang it in with, so we had to make do with a frying pan instead. The night before the test, Troy and I crept down to the assault course on the bottom field, which was just across from a gate manned by a sentry. Luckily, it was a stormy night, so every time there was a clap of thunder, I whacked the nail in with a frying pan. It was like that scene from The Shawshank Redemption when Andy Dufresne is smashing a rock against the inside of a sewer pipe. My whole body shook from the impact, and the noise was terrible. Every time I hit the nail, the sentry came running out and we hit the deck. But after about 10 whacks with a frying pan, the nail was finally in. The next morning, we said to Yoda, "Mate, when you get to the wall, look down. 3 bricks up, there's a little something to assist you." We all went down to support the boys, and sure enough, when Yoda got to the wall, he bounced straight over it like a gymnast off a springboard. The instructors couldn't believe it, and everyone else who had been struggling did the same. We never got rumbled. Yoda passed and ended up becoming a major. A couple of years ago, I found out that he now runs a climbing wall in Bristol. As training progressed, I grew both physically and mentally stronger. In fact, I nearly broke the camp record for the Commando Test Endurance course, missing it by seconds. I was also handed my first leadership role as a section commander. That was quite a thing for someone so young, and it was awesome for my confidence. I just picked up my section commander tabs when I bumped into John from my hometown, who looked uncharacteristically sheepish. I said to him, "What are you doing here? I thought you'd passed." John looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him up. I'm in Hunter Troop," he said. At that time, Hunter Troop consisted of all the people who got injured and rarely made it through. So I was absolutely over the moon. This bloke had told everyone he'd passed and was going to be on the training team, and it turned out he had been back squatted and was on his way out. Obviously, being the mature person I was, I told everyone who cared to listen and made sure the whole of Burton knew about it. Exaggerating your experience in the military, known as bloating, never goes down very well. John never did pass, and I doubt the fact that he inadvertently helped me on my way was of much consolation. Seeing my parents at my pass out at Lympstone was one of my proudest moments. Standing there in my Royal Marines parade dress, the peak cap and so-called blues, made me feel so powerful. I felt like a medieval knight in his suit of armour. Before that moment, I'd been a bundle of trouble, causing people bother, failing at school, never giving anything back. But now I felt like I was giving back in a big way. Mum loved the idea of me going into the military. When she was younger, she'd been accepted as an officer in the Royal Navy, but Dad didn't want her to join. She's always regretted it, so I suspect that me going in was feeding that passion. She was also relieved because only a few years earlier, she'd been dealing with a kid who was off the rails. I could tell that my dad was proud as well, but as far as I was concerned, that day was mostly about my mum, who had sacrificed so much in bringing me up. After passing out, I went up to 4-5 Commando in Scotland, which was renowned as the Arctic Warfare Unit. It had a reputation for being the hardest, and that's exactly what I wanted to experience. What a mistake. I should have gone down to 40 Commando in Taunton. While my lot were nicknamed the Arctic Warriors, the lads down there were nicknamed the Sunshine Boys. When I turned up in Scotland, I thought it was joining up with the best of the best, the absolute cream. I was incredibly keen and naive. On arrival, I dumped my bag in the guardroom, had some dinner, and was escorted to my accommodation. When I opened my bag, I found a piece of paper sitting on top of my clothes. On it, someone had drawn a big cock and balls and written, "Welcome to 4-5, new boy knobber." I thought, what the hell have I done? It was someone telling me not to get too big for my boots, to stay in my box. I thought it was quite funny, but I realised that there was probably more to come. There were lots of beatings going on, usually after a night on the piss. I was aware that the new boys get the beats, it was just a case of when. My initiation came when I returned from the pub early, fell asleep, and a guy called Ray jumped on top of me and planted his knee in my face, smashing my nose to pieces. I was supposed to be going on my first exercise to Holland the next day, but ended up in hospital instead. This had been my dream, my passion, and this was my first taste of it. I expected some sort of initiation, even a bit of rough stuff, but what I couldn't understand was why this idiot had done what he'd done when he'd only recently passed out himself. Oh well, welcome to the Royal Marines. What the commanding officer thought was going on and what was actually going on were two different things. Because Marines are extremists by their very nature, there was all kinds of ridiculous shit happening that made rugby club antics look tame. The new boys would have to drink a death wet, which was a pint of the top shelf of spirits, all mixed together and downed in one. That can kill people. Another time we were drinking in town and one of the older guys tried to set me up with this girl. She wasn't really my cup of tea, but this guy kept egging me on, telling me to chat her up and take her home. Despite the copious amount of drink, I managed to resist. The next morning, this guy said to me, "Good job you never went with her. She's got HIV. I thought it was a joke. It wasn't. It turned out her nickname was Mary the Marine Tester from 4-5. The humour was just so very dark, sadistic and raw. If you didn't go along with the initiations, the banter and the dangerous drinking, you didn't fit in. And if you didn't fit in, you might find yourself being relentlessly picked on. It was par for the course, the natural thing to do, to the extent that even people who are actually quite nice ended up being bullies, just to be accepted. The Falklands War had happened in 1982, 8 years before I joined the Marines. But it wasn't usually the guys who fought there who dished this stuff out. It was mostly the guys who joined later. Maybe it was simply because they were younger. Maybe it was down to frustration at missing out on war. Making people do stupid things after a few drinks, singing songs and wearing daft clothes is fine. In fact, there's a long-standing tradition in the Royal Marines of dressing up as women. Legend has it that every Marine has a suitcase under his bed full of beautiful dresses that even their mums would be jealous of, as well as stockings, suspenders, wigs, and nail varnish. The attention to detail is meticulous. Even I got involved once or twice and looked absolutely knockout. I once went to a fancy dress day at school as a fairy, so it was second nature. That sort of stuff is pretty out there, but it's harmless fun. When I'd been in for a few months and was considered to be a bit of an old sweat, by rights it was my turn to dish out the beats. Instead, I sent one of the new boys, Tim McAllister, who would later be best man at my wedding, out to hire a sunbed. That was a slightly nicer initiation than getting the shit beaten out of him. The whole dorm ended up with nice tans and we even made a few quid out of it, because we charged lads from other dorms to come and use it. What that story also tells you is that I always possessed a modicum of business acumen. Beating people up and pissing on them while they are asleep to humiliate and demoralise them isn't harmless fun at all. It's outright bullying, and I hated it. In case you were wondering, Ray, the guy who smashed my nose, didn't end up being a mate. He ended up getting done for manslaughter. I joined the Royal Marines out of a deep passion to serve my country and test myself to the limit. This was an organisation I had idolised since I was a kid. So, seeing blokes who were supposed to be on my side doing things like that made me feel discouraged and a bit disappointed. How could I have admiration and respect for these people? They probably would have characterised their bullying as character building. But it was horrible, knowing that every night your door could be burst open and people could rush in and start dishing out beats. I'd known that fear before. It didn't exactly stoke my enthusiasm. Instead, it chipped away at my faith. Chapter 2. Wild Child. Through an opening in the canvas, I could see a beautiful circle of sunlit grass, closed off by lorries and neighbouring tents. In the centre of the clearing, something was moving. Although viewed from the darkness of the shelter, it was nothing more than a black smudge, its edges blurred by the searing sun. As if in a trance, I left the safety of the canopy and crept squinting into the light. The sky was an unbroken swathe of blue, and the heat made my skin prickle. I blinked away the sunspots, the edges sharpened, and soon the black smudge took shape. It was a baby chimpanzee, quietly hoo-hooing to himself, between mouthfuls of assorted fruit that lay scattered around his feet. At that moment, my whole world was made up of me and that baby chimp. It was a little bit of heaven and nothing else mattered. I held my breath and ventured closer. My mouth was dry and my heart felt like it might burst through my chest. But excitement overrode apprehension. I stood over my new friend, who looked straight up at me. He had beautiful big brown eyes and looked so innocent and vulnerable. We stared into each other's eyes for what seemed like an eternity. It was as if we had become locked together by some strange animal magnetism. I finally remembered to breathe. The chimp looked away, breaking the connection, and sniffed at the grass before picking up a piece of fruit and passing it to me. It was a thrilling moment. Here I was, hanging out with a wild animal. I'd entered David Attenborough territory, the stuff of dreams. I took the fruit, pretended to eat it, but threw it over my shoulder instead. The chimp didn't seem to mind. He hoo-hooed contentedly while I beamed back at him. I'd never been so happy. I felt like I could cry. The serenity was broken by what sounded like a fighter jet tearing through the sky. Even now, when I recall that shriek, it makes me want to clamp my hands over my ears. My eyes were drawn to a shape shuffling under a lorry, the shadow it cast becoming suddenly bigger and smaller as it went about its business. Before I could hazard a guess at what it might be, it had shot from the shadows and into the clearing. It was another chimp, but 10 times as big as my new best buddy, and evidently far less friendly. The ambush was on. The big chimp ploughed towards me in a sidewards gallop, her enormous arms crashing into the turf and her legs swinging seamlessly behind them. Her shrieking became louder and louder, as if she was trying to bury me in sound. Soon she was so close I could see her enormous teeth unsheathed for battle. Seconds earlier, I had been bathing in bliss. Now I was in a state of terror. My animal instinct kicked in and I contemplated escaping. But when you're faced with a 50-kilogram ape, you can't contemplate for long. The big chimp came around the back of her little friend, as if measuring the distance, and when it had got to within about 20 feet of me, decided to pounce. What had been a beautiful bright blue was suddenly black, and getting blacker fast. It was as if the sky had collapsed and was falling in on me. The big chimp landed right on top of me and pinned me to the floor, like a cartoon boulder. She swung her thick arms above her head and brought them down with great force onto my chest and face, like a drummer in a rock band attacking her kit. She buried her face in mine, gnashed her teeth, and swiveled her neck from side to side like a dog with a rag doll. I covered my head with my hands, but when I opened my eyes and looked through my fingers, I saw that those teeth were dripping with blood. I could feel no pain, but I instinctively knew it was my blood, not the chimp's. It was at that moment, the most horrendous moment of my life, that pure blind panic was replaced by the urge to live. I realised I had a choice. Either I stayed on my back and let this ape beat me into an early grave, or I attempted to escape. In other words, I had to make the situation worse in order to make it better. The baby chimp was chained to a peg, so I hoped beyond hope that my attacker was as well. I somehow managed to twist my body, which knocked my attacker off balance and created a little bit of space between us. I brought my foot up and smashed it into the chimp's chest before scrambling back a couple of feet. The chimp regained her footing and came hurtling towards me again. But just as she was about to come crashing down on top of me for a second time, the chain that was indeed attached to her collar went taut. The chimp had lost none of her ferocity. Her shrieking was as loud and horrific as ever. Blood was everywhere, and I had no idea what parts of my body it was spurting from. But I was out of harm's way, albeit by a matter of inches. You might be wondering where I was serving when this incident took place. After all, chimpanzees are pretty thin on the ground in the Middle East. The truth is, I was only 10 years old, and chimps were part of a circus visiting Burton-on-Trent. Which goes to show you most pivotal moments, those moments that change the course of your life, can last for seconds, spring from the most unlikely of situations, and be almost impossibly surreal. My soul has been laid bare in Special Forces selection. I've raided boats laden with drugs and hardened criminals out at sea and under the cover of darkness. I've had machine guns pointed in my face and been under siege. But none of that came close to dicing with death with the angry circus ape. That snap decision to escape, a decision that was instinctive, that I was barely aware I was making, was what kept me alive. That was my first break point. I don't remember much about being a kid. My childhood was a series of traumatic events that hung like enormous dark clouds over any of the good stuff. What I do know is that I was always a black sheep. My earliest memory is being at a very posh private prep school called St. Wistons in the Derbyshire village of Repton. One day, I almost strangled a kid called Toby, who was my best friend at the time. I must have been about 5, and I think we were just messing around, but it was a sign of the trouble to come. My father had an engineering business in Repton, and the fact that me and my brother and sister all went to private prep school suggests it was successful. But I feel like my childhood was stolen from me. My father was very Victorian and very disciplined. He was never an affectionate man, although I don't blame him for that. That was just a norm for fathers in those days. But he was also a workhorse, and he expected us to work as hard as he did. We weren't allowed to be normal kids like our friends were. When other kids were out playing, my father would have us helping out with all kinds of stuff. Whether it was building walls, sawing wood, mowing lawns, or taking the dogs for marathon walks. We had a big house with loads of land and lots of really steep banks. Once a month, my brother and I would go out and cut the lawns with a fly mower attached to a piece of rope, lowering it down the banks and pulling it back up again. Once we'd done that, we'd chop a load of firewood. Then we'd get on our bikes, cycle to my granddad's house about 6 miles away to cut the grass in his orchard before cycling home again. That was a normal weekend. At times, it felt like I was my dad's employee rather than his son. My dad was always extremely generous at Christmas. That was his way of showing love. But that didn't stop him buying us some pretty weird presents. One year there were 2 presents under the tree for me and my brother, and you could tell by the shape they were the same thing. When we unwrapped them, we saw that they were axes. I was only about 12. We said to each other, "Why's Dad got us axes? We're a bit old to be playing cowboys and Indians." 2 days later, we were out chopping down trees for him. The house was enormous and had stables, although we didn't have horses. Instead, the stables were filled with kindling and logs for the winter, and my dad would have us chopping that wood all weekend. One weekend, one of my mates was supposed to come round the house and never turned up. At school the following Monday, I said to him, "What happened to you?" "Mate, I came round and your dad had me chopping wood for about 2 hours. When he decided I was finished, he told me you weren't coming out anyway." My dad hadn't even told me he had been there. A story like that gets around the school pretty fast. Soon, nobody was coming to visit. While I don't remember having a lot of fun growing up, I was always a risk taker and getting into trouble. On a holiday in Lyme Regis, I went for a walk with my brother and sister, and just when my mum and dad were beginning to wonder where we got to, they heard this commotion coming from the harbour wall. They wandered over to see what was going on and found me launching myself off the wall and into the sea, while crowds of older kids stood around cheering. I was only 3 years old. Another year in Lyme Regis, a big fishing hook went through the top of my leg. But because it was my favourite hook, the only thing I cared about was the fact they'd have to cut it off. And there was the time in France when I dropped a couple of bottles of lemonade in a shop and they exploded onto my legs. When I returned to the caravan, my legs were caked in blood and my poor mum was hysterical. When I was about 7, I watched a Tom and Jerry cartoon in which Jerry electrocuted Tom and you could see all his bones lit up inside him. I thought that looked brilliant and wondered if it worked in real life. So I went upstairs to my bedroom, took out the bulb of the bedside lamp and stuck my thumb in the socket. The lights all over the house started flickering and my mum could hear me from downstairs, going off like a car alarm. When she burst into my bedroom, my hair was standing up on end and smoking, as was my thumb. I've still got a lump on my thumb from that incident today. There was also the time my brother and sister locked me in a suitcase and stuffed me in a cupboard. I managed to escape, fell out of the cupboard and landed on top of a Tonka toy, split my nose open. Oh, and I almost forgot, I was run over twice. The first time I was on my roller skates, went between 2 parked cars and got hit by a Granada, dislocating my shoulder and trapping all the nerves. I could have lost my arm because the blood supply was cut off. The second time I was on my BMX, showing off in front of some girls. I almost felt sorry for that chimp. There she was, minding her own business on her afternoon off, and then a mentalist like me came wandering into her life. I'd be the kid who went hunting through the house for Christmas presents. My brother and sister, who are both older than me, would say, "Why are you doing that for? We don't want to ruin Christmas." My parents would have all sorts of systems in place, everything but the laser tripwire, but I'd ransack the house and find it all. At the same time, I'd hate my brother and sister's birthdays because I was a Christmas baby and it never seemed like I had a birthday. My parents ended up buying me a present as well, just so I didn't kick off. We all played together and were close, but apart from the fact that I looked like my brother, it was like I was a different breed. Justin, the middle sibling, was the one we took the piss out of for being a swat. When I was getting some mad game for Christmas, he was getting a computer. Personality-wise, I was closer to my sister Ashley, although we were always quite different. But it was after I was attacked by the chimpanzee that I really started going off the rails, and those differences became more obvious. The day that turned out to be such a pivotal moment in my life had started so innocuously. It was a boiling hot morning in the summer holidays, and my brother and I were stuck for something to do. James Stafford, my brother's best mate who lived a few streets away, locked us up and asked if we wanted to go swimming. Mum got our kit ready and soon we were making our way to the baths. Crossing the ferry bridge over the River Trent, we noticed some big tops being set up on some waste ground. The circus had come to town. Swimming was suddenly out of the window, because when you're a 10-year-old kid, the circus coming to town is just about the best thing ever. My heart started racing and our pace quickened. We asked the guy in the entrance if we could see the animals, to which he replied, "Yeah, of course. All the animals are on chains. You boys will be fine." Inside the first big top we came to was an elephant. Inside the second were some little monkeys, who showed me their fangs when I got too close. I was in my own little world and at some point became separated from my brother and James. Then I came across the baby chimpanzee in the clearing. What happened next would impact the rest of my life in unthinkable ways. That attack lasted such a short amount of time, but was like a tiny stone being thrown into a big pond, causing ripples that last to this day. Having seen off the chimp, I experienced a moment of elation, followed by a burst of relief, but the relief was short-lived. When I looked down, I could see blood splattered all over me, then the whole place erupted. I was discovered by one of the circus workers, and I can still picture her face as she placed her hand on the back of my arm. It was a look of horror, partly because of the severity of my wounds, and partly, I suspect, because she knew there would be a legal case against the circus. Part of my right forearm had been torn away. There was stringy white muscle and what I assume were tendons hanging off it. It looked like a bone that had been slobbered over by a dog all day. My other arm was covered in bites. I was not a pretty sight. Before I knew it, I was in an ambulance being rushed to a local hospital. Meanwhile, James, who was a bit of a chubby lad, was running back to my house to tell my mum the news. He'd never run so fast and probably hasn't done since. When my mum answered the door, James was standing there red-faced and out of breath. My poor mum had been enjoying a rare day off work, kid-free, And suddenly, there was someone standing on a doorstep informing her that her son had been attacked by a chimpanzee. How on earth do you react to that? I think it's safe to say that she was somewhat taken aback. I was turned away from the hospital, presumably because they didn't have the correct facilities. To be fair, chimp attacks were quite rare in Burton-on-Trent in 1980. And at the second hospital, they made a complete hash of the treatment. They should have done a skin graft. Instead, they put stitches all around the wound and yanked it tight. It was never going to heal like that. When they removed the bandage a couple of weeks later, the doctor cut the first stitch and the wound burst open, like a badly packed kebab. But all they did was restitch and redress and send me on my way. About a week later, we went to France for a family holiday. That was the worst holiday ever. Every day, I'd have to watch my brother and sister playing in the sea, while I sat on the beach with a plastic bag over my arm. We were staying in a caravan, and one day my father was maniacally cleaning up. As he was going about his business, he picked up an unusual smell. He couldn't work out what it was. It was driving him mad. He was tracing it up and down the caravan, getting stressed, pushing bleach down the toilet and the sink. I was lying out on the sofa reading a book when he homed in on my arm like a bloodhound and started sniffing me. Suddenly he took my arm, removed the bag and unwound the bandage, and there on my arm were all these green spots. Gangrene had set in, followed by panic. My dad called a taxi, bundled me in the back, and we set off for Saint-Tropez. About an hour later, we arrived at the surgery, and they got me straight into a room and onto a bed. The doctor told my dad to get on top of me and hold me down, and suddenly my dad was on the bed with his knee in my chest. It was like a scene from an 18th century battle, back when surgeons would climb on top of casualties and chop limbs off without anaesthetic. The doctor grabbed what looked like a scrubbing brush, covered it in ethanol, and started scouring my arm, as if it was a frying pan caked in burnt-on food. I can still hear my screaming now. They must have been able to hear it as far away as Paris. It was pure torture, almost as traumatic as being attacked by the chimp, and it felt like my dad was one of the torturers. After I'd been patched up and dosed up with antibiotics, the doctors led us to a different part of the surgery, a beautiful room with high painted ceilings. Probably because he felt a bit guilty about what he'd just done to his son. The doctor introduced my dad to a glamorous lady with a blonde beehive, and they kissed each other cheek to cheek. No doubt, my dad also threw in the odd line of Del Boy French. This woman was stunning, but I wasn't interested. I was a 10-year-old boy who had just been scrubbed free of gangrene, which was the worst pain I'd ever experienced. All I wanted at that moment was a hug, some much-needed love from my father, but it never came. Not then, not later. My dad paid the bill, which was probably a horrific amount of money. We said our goodbyes, and I noticed that while my dad didn't seem at all interested about what I'd just been through, he seemed absolutely elated about something. When we were out on the street, he looked down at me with wide, starstruck eyes and said, "Son, I can't believe it. I've just met Brigitte Bardot." I had no idea who this woman was. It was like some weird black comedy. One scene I was being attacked by a chimpanzee, the next I was having my gangrenous arm scrubbed, the next I was meeting a famous French film star. Or at least my dad was. When Dad told my mum the story, he was overcome with excitement. It seemed to me as if the chimp attack and hospital trauma had all been worth it, because he had got to meet Brigitte Bardot. After leaving prep school, I was sent to Abbot Bain, which was a comprehensive in Burton. I look back at my time at St. Wiston's, which was a feeder school for the prestigious Repton, and realised just how privileged I'd been. Even now, I have a passion for that kind of private schooling, the kind that pushes its pupils. My brother, sister and I were quite posh, and that made us stick out like sore thumbs in state school. I wasn't really in with the cool kids, although I was comfortable with that. I had a few friends at school, and the little clique that I was part of was high enough up the food chain that I never got bullied. We were all kind of well-to-do from middle-class families with nice houses. It turned me into a bit of a closet snob and reinforced the idea that I was a bit different. Not only that, I liked the fact that I was different. I was the only pupil to wear a double-breasted blazer, when most of the other kids were happy to wear a blazer with the arms and pockets hanging off. I got my love of clothes from my dad, who always looked impeccable. Actually, I didn't share this trait just with my dad because my stepbrother Mark, from my dad's first marriage, was also a smart dresser. Mark always looked cool, had a pretty girlfriend, and even drove a Capri Gear. I looked up to him. We always stayed close. Me and my mates were into the modern ska scene, the jam, madness, the beat. I had this beautiful pair of black and white shoes that I had to hide from my dad because he had a very clear idea of how I should and shouldn't dress. I sneak clothes out of the house in a plastic bag and get changed around the corner. But when I look back at my old photos now, I realise I didn't really look much like Paul Weller or Suggs. To be honest, I just looked a bit pathetic. I was good at some things as a kid, including art. One day my brother bought the 12-inch version of Relax by Frankie Goes to Hollywood, the one featuring a muscly bloke with a woman on his back with pointy tits and wearing thigh-high boots. I drew it and thought it was brilliant. A few days later I came home from school and couldn't find my drawing. My dad had found it and torn it up because it was sexual and he found it disgusting. Other times, he'd give me a good hiding. It was just slaps with the back of his hand, and I don't resent him for that. You could argue some kids nowadays could do with something similar. But at the time, so much resentment had built up that I'd come to despise him. After another incident, the details of which slipped my mind, I came out of my bedroom in tears and said, "I fucking hate that cunt." Unbeknown to me, he was standing on the landing. I backed into a corner, thinking I was going to get a beating, but instead he gave me a cuddle. It was a bizarre moment, the only time I remember anything like that happening and harbouring any affection for him. Unfortunately, it felt like he was uncomfortable doing it, so it was hard to receive it. When someone who's normally cold suddenly starts hugging you or saying nice things, your natural reaction is to think that something is not quite right. Then, when I was 13, my dad upped and left. Just disappeared one day without any explanation. I'm told he phoned Mum from the airport, told her he was leaving and wouldn't be coming back again. It was extremely traumatic for my mum, especially because her parents, who I'd also been very close to, had recently died within 3 months of each other. She was lumbered with 3 kids, a big house and a crippling mortgage, because my dad refused to give her any money. Mum tells me now that she was having to steal toilet roll from work to make ends meet. I wrote my dad letters telling him we couldn't afford to go out or buy clothes, but he wasn't interested. My mum never badmouthed him in front of us, but I later learned that he'd always been a bit of a player. You can try to read too much into relationship breakdowns. Sometimes it's as simple as your dad meeting someone else and deciding that being with her would be more fun. The grass is always greener. When times got tough, he decided that the best solution was to walk out, close the door and disappear. I didn't understand it at the time, but I'd end up doing something similar. I didn't share my mum's distress at my dad's departure. As far as I was concerned, it was the best thing that had ever happened to me. It was like a massive weight had fallen from my shoulders. That's not how most kids react when their fathers walk out. But just because I thought dad leaving was great, that didn't mean it was good for everyone around me. Suddenly the shackles were off and I could live as I wanted to. That meant complete and utter mayhem.